It's time for another episode of Hometown Historic Churches. Hey everybody, it's Jonathan Miller, as always, here at the Hometown Historic Channel. That step down was a little nuts. We're here today at the First EC, Evangelical Congregational Church, or what used to be First Evangelical Congregational Church, here on a Saturday morning, and it is quite foggy. We're right across from St. Luke's Episcopal. This is on the corner of 6th and Chestnut, and we're going to talk a little bit about the history of the church, and we're going to show you the architecture and then go over to what was the building before this one. So here we are. This is the building. It was built in 1897. We'll go over to the cornerstone. You can see there it says 1897. This is another one of those churches I'd really like to get into, if possible. There's now a Spanish-speaking church is here. Latino Community Church took over the facility. They wound out shutting down, I believe. It might have been last year that they shut down, because it just is one of those situations with churches. The inner city churches, sometimes it's hard for them to exist as they had once existed because of parking issues is a major thing, and we'll talk a little bit more about the history of the church. One of the things I want to show is this is actually has gargoyles at the top. You can see it there. There's one there, just like St. Luke's over there has 4 that are off of the main tower there. But yeah, it's pretty cool, because I think there was only one other church besides these 2 in Lebanon that had gargoyles, and that was the old Catholic church, and they wound out tearing that down, unfortunately. But I'd like to get inside to check out the stained glass. But this church was actually started, didn't have a building yet, but I guess they had a pastor, which we'll talk more about it. He was sort of a traveling Evangelical Association pastor, had come into the area, and they wound up having 12 charter members, and that was 1826. And this part of the building is 1906. This is sort of like one of those buildings that it was built over time, because they had back then, before around 1900, churches started to change, where they went away from Sunday school being the primary service to the primary service being a normal church service, and then the Sunday school was afterwards. Because you'll see a lot of these old churches, the first floor was for Sunday school, and the second floor was for the congregational meeting, because it was just, that's how they did it. Now, as the congregation sort of aged, they couldn't go up to that second floor anymore, so Sunday school went to the second floor and became no longer the primary service, and the main service was then held down on the first floor. Because you'll see that at Salem Evangelical Lutheran. We visited St. Luke's. I visited Lutheran Church in Schaefferstown, the same way. Quite a few of them are all, that's how they're built. But yeah, they had Fellowship Hall built later, and the parsonage is this building here. It's just a really neat looking building, and it has so much history. But 1830 they built their first church, and then Eventually, I guess a lot of these churches, they would be in people's homes, and supposedly there might have been another facility that had been built, like log structure, and that burnt down. But this building over here, this is the church that they built. This is not the original structure that was on this property. There was actually another one, and I believe that one burnt down, I think 1849. I'll have the exact information for you guys. But they rebuilt, because the original structure was built in 1830, and then because they bought this parcel of land for, like, I think it was $2, and original structure burnt down. Then they built another one. That one lasted until 1897, or it was like 1896, when they just sort of outgrew it, and that's when they built the current structure that's there now. But this, you really think about the history of a lot of these city churches, and this building, I'll just quick note this as well, this was the Lebanon Library. So when they went from this facility over to the new facility over there, I think 1907 is when the Lebanon Library wound up taking over that facility, and they were there for quite a bit of time. But you just see the beautiful decorative like gingerbreading and stuff like that. It's really cool. But the church over here, from the 20s through into even the 60s, they had about 900,000 people showing up. So I mean, it was an impressive church, like a congregation. And then, unfortunately, over time, with there not being any parking, people didn't want to have to walk so far and try to struggle for parking as the vehicle took over quite a bit more, and the church just slowly dwindled to the point that it no longer could function as a congregation, and they wound up joining up with the Myerstown Evangelical Congregational Church, and that's where they are now. But this is just sort of, has such a great influence on the community, such a beautiful building, and it's just sort of, you see more and more of this. We talked about even with Union Salem church that we just did a video on. They now have decided as a congregational meeting that they're going to shut down, and that's more of a situation where you're a country church where you're not really within a community per se, so it's just no longer able to support a church congregation, unfortunately. And this just sort of happened here as well. But thankfully, this Latino church has taken over and is using this facility. So I'm hoping at some point we'll be able to get in here and then show you the stained glass and show you, because the building is beautiful inside. I'm told that they have a balcony, and it's a really neat church sanctuary as well. So at some point we're going to try to get in there and get together with the congregation to be able to show the inside like we did with St. Luke's. So with that, we'll have a little bit more information with the pictures and audio, and we'll go from there. And as always, I just want to say thanks for coming along, and we'll see you all about town.
Hey everybody, so as promised, we're going to come back to talk a little bit more in depth about this first Evangelical Congregational Church of Lebanon. So you can't start talking about this church without talking about its history. And its history starts with Jacob Albright and John Walter. So we've talked about both of them. John Walter with the Pennsylvania Historic Marker there in Ono next to Mount Nebo Cemetery, and Jacob Albright in Kleinfeldersville with his Pennsylvania Historic Marker. And then we went from the Pennsylvania Historic Marker that was along, I'm trying to think what the route number is, but it's right there across from the post office in Kleinfeldersville and the Kleinfeldersville Hotel. But just right down the road is the Jacob Memorial Chapel, which is where Jacob Albright is buried. And these two individuals, John Walter and Jacob Albright, are responsible for the creation of the Evangelical Association. So how this led to be is Jacob Albright was actually a German immigrant, just like John Walter, but he was a Lutheran, and he had a crisis of faith. He and his wife lost two of their children quite suddenly. It's one of those things back in that time period in the late 1700s, 1800s. You had like the scarlet fever, yellow fever that went around. And we visited a lot of cemeteries, and you'll see like a whole line of children that all died within like a month of each other. And that was usually what happened, because it's those types of things came through. They didn't have any way to really treat them, and it was usually a death sentence, especially to children. So he lost two of his children, and he felt like the Lutheran Church at that time did not provide, beyond the soul. They did not provide for when there were trials and tribulations like this, and he was quite disappointed with that. And he felt that what he saw in Christ's ministry when he was here on earth, that he showed love of his Father, especially when people were hurting. You think of when Lazarus passed, that he, the verse Jesus wept is a very powerful verse, because it wasn't a thing where he just came there, oh, I'm going to cry. He was crying, and there was actually several reasons, maybe even for that, beyond just that Lazarus had passed and this was someone that he loved. He was weeping with the family, but also, Lazarus would have been in paradise at that stage, and he was bringing him back from that place to earth again. So that might have also been a reason that Jesus wept as well. So, but that was something that stuck profoundly with Jacob Albright, and he felt that there was a better way to the church for it to deal with its parishioners through these times of trial, sadness, and sorrow. And he met a young man named John Walter, who was about 20 years his junior. I think it was 18 years, if I remember correctly, but he felt very much the same. This was a young man who always had health problems. He was very vibrant, very gifted hymn writer, and turned out to be that he was a very gifted preacher as well. But he only spoke German, and Jacob Albright had found solace in the Methodist Church of the period. He felt that they better dealt with that. But like the Lutherans, the Moravians, the Reformed Church, the Brethren, Mennonites, and those type of individuals were all German based in origin, whereas the Methodist, Presbyterian, and Episcopalians were all English in origin. So the Methodist Church at that time, it wasn't a nasty thing or anything like that, but because they were English in origin, they only held their services in English. And primarily in this region, Lebanon, Lancaster County, very much German populations, immigrant populations, and a lot of them only spoke German. So the German populations were highly neglected when it came to church. They had their Lutheran and a Reformed, but like I said, he felt that there needed to be a church that was German in origin, that spoke to much more than just the quote-unquote spiritual needs. And then it delved a little further. So he tried to get the Methodist Church to agree to allow him to preach in German. He said, these people are neglected. I feel the way you serve your congregations is a much better path and the right foot forward, but they wouldn't agree to it. So amicably, he split from them, and with meeting with John Walter, they decided to start the Evangelical Association. And Evangelical Association's core tenets were about love and compassion. I think of 1 Corinthians chapter 13, the love chapter, and that was what they were about. Not only scripturally being sound, doctrinally being sound, but also is about showing love and meeting the needs of their congregation beyond just the spiritual. So that church started, and Jacob Albright was very much part of that until, I believe it was 1808. He got tuberculosis when he was preaching over in Linglestown, Pennsylvania, and tuberculosis was, in essence, once again, it was a death sentence back then, and he knew that he didn't have a whole lot of time, so he was making his way back over to Ephrata where he lived, and he made it as far as Kleinfeldersville to George Becker's homestead, and George Becker was John Walter's brother-in-law, and it was there that he passed away. He was buried in the Becker family plot, which eventually would become the Albright Memorial Chapel, which we visited. There's a memorial for him. He is buried there, and right in that area is where the Evangelical Association would hold their annual meetings at the George Becker homestead for quite a while until it moved to Orwigsburg, and then eventually, I believe, moved to like Reading or something along those lines, which we'll get into. But that's sort of the prepping of how this all started as the Evangelical Association started to grow. It started to send its pastors out to promote the Evangelical Association, and this is where the starting of the first Evangelical Congregational Church began. So it started in, I believe, 1826. They had a Reverend John Seibert. He went to Lebanon, Pennsylvania, and preached, made quite the impression in this area, and the first Sunday school was started, and usually they started them how it was they did back then, is you had 12 charter members, and they went from there, and as the first meeting there in Lebanon, which would be the beginnings of this church. So for about 4 years, they would meet in this area of like Chestnut Street, where the church is presently today. There was a home there that they met at on Chestnut Street. I forget what they had. It might have been even an address, but they met there. They'd meet at other houses. It's sort of St. John's that I've talked about is coming to mind before they were able to put the money together for a church building. They met at a couple of the charter members' homes for quite a while. So in this case, it was only 4 years. And in 1830, they were able to get a plot of ground where the building here on Chestnut Street, which is next to Harding Elementary, was built. Now, the original structure would have been a log structure, because back then, unless you had a wealthy parishioner or you had a much larger group of people to be able to put together funds, it wasn't going to be brick or stone. Stone was only going to be if you had a very, very wealthy patron, sort of like with St. Luke's Episcopal, they had the Colemans. A lot of these smaller country churches, they were log just out of necessity. It just made financial sense. So they actually had the first actual Sunday school was held in 1832, and then by 1835 it had built to the degree that the General Conference was now held in Orwigsburg, Pennsylvania, and it was finally reported to that conference to make it official and part of the actual Evangelical Association. Even though you considered yourself, I think until you finally reported, you weren't necessarily part of that. I might be wrong on that, so somebody correct me. Now, sadly, in 1849, as did happen quite often, these wood structures, there was a fire and the first meeting house was destroyed. Now, the second structure that we see presently, this was then built in 1849. Now, they have two date stones. They have 1830, which would when the plot of ground was deeded, and then 1907, which is, I believe, when it was deeded to the Lebanon library system. But they used this facility till 1897, and then after that, it would have functioned for a time with the church yet, and then it would have gone over to the Lebanon Library. So this current structure, this is the one that was built in 1897. You had that parley we talked about earlier in the video. That's the original Sunday school building. Now, the interesting thing about these churches and something to talk about, in a lot of the original structures, the way churches were functioned is the Sunday school was the primary service. It was just sort of how they did things, what they called it. They did organize in that regard. And then the other service, congregational service, was secondary. Well, around 1900, that began to change. As congregations got older, a lot of these churches had the Sunday school was held on the second floor. First floor was for the regular meetings. They sort of, you think about back when a lot of these churches were made, the older ones, or when the congregation started. This was frontier days. These were new immigrants, so a lot of them were young. They didn't know how long this was going to last. So they didn't think, say, 100 years in the future, even 50 years in the future, our current parishioners are going to get to the stage where they can't handle the stairs. And so they had to switch things around. Now, in this case, they didn't have something like that. So they were very, very fortunate in that regard. But they needed a Sunday school building, and that's what this original one was. Now, around 1900, it sort of flip-flopped. So the Sunday school became the first service, but not the primary service, and the congregational service became the primary service. So it sort of changed the functioning of the churches. So they wound up going from like sort of the Sunday school setup in the building to wind out having to build a congregational, main sanctuary. And that's where this headed. And one of the things they were fortunate in as well, with the history of the Evangelical Association, it was right around the time that they built this new church that there was a schism in the church. And Evangelical Association wound up splitting because of doctrinal issues. And it was actually that fierce and the frustrations that great that it actually came into fisticuffs. And a lot of the Evangelical Congregational churches, which was the group that broke off from the Evangelical Association, they lost their churches because the Evangelical Association owned those buildings. Now, this church in particular, the first Evangelical Congregational, I believe they owned all their own stuff, so they never really ran into that problem. Whereas churches like St. John's that we visited and Union-Salem, which we just recently visited, they both lost their churches. Now, St. John's was able to get theirs back just because of location, and it didn't serve any purpose for the Evangelical Association, so they got that back, but that was always afterwards, was like, we're never going to be in that position again. Union-Salem wound up being able to go over to the Union-Salem church that the brethren were using, but not very often. But it was just one of those things that they ran into. So they wanted, this church in particular as well, wanted to own all their own stuff. And they wound out outgrowing their current structure. So they wound out having to do something quite unique. They needed to create a basement, but because the stone was so solid, they had to do blasting techniques. And they weren't sure how that was going to work. So they actually lifted the church up. And where there's a will, there's a way, apparently, and it worked out. And in 1919, I think, is when they were trying to do that, and by 1926, they had a dedication of this newly constructed basement. Now, by the time they got to 1847, that was the 115th anniversary of the first Sunday school, and by the time you got into the 60s, they had created the Christian Education Building, which is on the western side of the building, and the parsonage was probably built in some time at that stage too. And into the 70s, it was the 75th anniversary that they celebrated dealing with the first Sunday school building. So it really is an extraordinary building, and this is one of those buildings that, we've talked about. A ton of people, when they built a lot of these structures as well, they did balconies, and both Robert Stallnecker, who provided this history, and my friend Bob both went there, and they talked about this balcony. Beautiful, but they had from the 20s to into the 70s like 900 to 1,000 people, so this thing was loaded. And back then they didn't have the building codes that we have today, so they finally had to stop using it because it was
probably dangerous just because of the building techniques. But this really had to be such an extraordinary place to go to, just because how many people were there, the services were extraordinary and all those types of things. And it just, sadly, because of over time passing, there not being parking, things of that nature, the church dwindled over time. And eventually, tried to do what they could. But, it's just, we talked about this in the past with other churches, and we just seen recently with Union Salem, the needs of the community change, the congregation's needs change, and it just dwindles over time to the point where they have to choose to either join up with another church, which is what this church did, joining over with Myerstown Evangelical Congregational, and just not being able to maintain the facility like they'd like to. But really just an extraordinary history here for First Evangelical Congregational Church of Lebanon.
So in closing, I just want to say thanks for coming along with this. It did, sadly, I think it was 2021. A lot of that, it had to do, there was a lot of things happening that led to the point where the church was just ultimately going to have to close. But COVID really hurt a lot of churches around that time period. And a lot of churches, and most churches, haven't necessarily recovered to their pre-COVID numbers. It's changed a lot of the ways we do things. And it was sort of, in essence, saying it's this final nail in the coffin to a lot of these organizations and churches. But it's cool as well that this building, this church, and all its history have a second life. A Spanish-speaking church has taken over the location, reaching out to the local Latino community, and it continues to live on. So, as I said before, I'd really like to be able to reach out to them, see if I can get in there, maybe be able to get a hold of somebody that really knows the history in depth, or can give me sort of what St. Luke's gave me, a pamphlet that has so much information in that we can continue to talk about this church even more, and obviously get access to be able to show the stained glass. This is, unlike St. Luke's, where it's more French geometric pattern stained glass, this is more English in origin. It's very, very beautiful stained glass, and it's unique in, well, not unique, but they used to have problems with people trying, today they still have it too, but people like to break things because they're idiots. So they actually added a protective glass exterior, which was good because apparently people were trying to shoot them out with BB guns, and somebody went as far as using a brick or a stone. But it was protected, thank goodness, because this is how people are. But there's just so many aspects of this architecturally, just really, really neat, and just to see the inside. Something also that was mentioned to me by both Robert Stallnecker, who provided a lot of this history, and my friend Bob. They used to have, when they started the church, they built it in 1897, they had an original pipe organ, like a really ornate, big pipe organ, which they said was extraordinary. Now, normally these things last 100 years or more. This one only lasted about 50, 52 years, because I believe they replaced it in 1949 with an electric pipe or electric organ, which is a shame because they both talked about you could go into the room where they had originally had the pipes, and that's where all the electric and electronics were for it. But it was just sort of like they never got to see that, and that was something they would have loved to have seen. But just the different aspects of the chapel area, it has to be extraordinary, seeing the balcony and just being able to view that interior from different angles. Something I'm hoping we'll be able to do. And just, it's just one of those things you would have liked to have seen what a center of the community this was when it was in its heyday, 900 to 1,000 people or more. And just how extraordinary that must have been. Like, this was the place to come to worship God. And it is nice to see that it's continuing to serve that purpose today. So I apologize, I will say, for my growly voice. The first part of this video was filmed probably about 4 or 5 days before I got sick. I'm in that stage where stuff is sort of like blah, blah, blah. So my voice is sort of blah, 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 going along with that. But this was a lot of fun. I'd really like to learn a lot more about this church. So I'm hoping, like, with St. Luke's, we can have sort of progression and be able to get in contact with the right people, or they get in contact with us, and then we're able to move forward from there and learn more, and have, like we'll have with St. Luke's here eventually, where it'll be a several part series that goes into different aspects of the architecture, the history of the church, the interior, exterior aspects that are very unique, and go from there. Maybe even be able to do some shorts on some very unique aspects of that history as well. So once again, as always, I want to say thank you for coming along. Thank you for tolerating this. And as always, we'll see you all about town.